All right, let me give a sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance Podcast. This is Ohan, and I'm sitting here today with Hannah.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here.
And I guess we'll just start it off with you directly. Hannah, do you want to tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm originally a psychologist. I then did my PhD in cognitive social neuroscience. I studied face perception, emotions, gaze directions, these kinds of things. And in the last 5 years, I've worked in computational social science at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. I did research there on collective emotions using social media data. We did a big project on suicide prevention via the media, so how content in the media influences suicide rates and help-seeking behavior. And importantly, that's why I'm here today, we also did a 4-year-long project on emotions and misinformation that we started just after the pandemic. And that's really how I got into the whole misinformation, social media, democracy, polarization debate.
Yeah, right on. And so what aspects of misinformation did you focus on?
We really focused on emotions and social dynamics around misinformation because we were pretty convinced from the start of the pandemic onwards that it's really people's social drives that drive them to believe in certain things rather than others, that drive them to seek certain kinds of information and not others. And we thought that measuring emotions on social media would be kind of a good signal to where important communication related to people's social identities was going on social media. And we also kind of found that that's the case. So we did a first study, kind of a pilot study, where we just measured people's emotions before they saw false or real news. And then we measured emotions in reaction to the news. And we really found that people do get angry after reading false news. But most of the people in our sample got angry because they disagreed with the fake news. They were angry that the fake news were being published. And only few people in our study, because it was a snowball sample and not a sample focused selectively on people who believe in misinformation, only a few people actually believed the false news, and they got angry about true news and about these kinds of news being spread. And I think that's a big hint to what the underlying root cause of misinformation is. From my perspective, it's really much more about partisanship, about social identity, rather than the content. So people share fake news because they don't trust the system, they don't trust the government, and they don't necessarily share it because they believe the content of the news. They might, but I think it was really interesting to see as we went from pre-pandemic, people who believe in misinformation were maybe anti-climate change measures, then they became anti-vaccine, then they became pro-Russian. So it didn't really matter what the content of the misinformation was, but it mattered a lot that it was against what the current establishment and government was believing in and promoting.
So it was more linked to what people identified as their group sets of beliefs,
yes,
rather than the actual information itself.
Yeah.
And so that runs counter to some of the narratives that say that information itself is the problem, rather than the environment of the information. And the social narratives, the politicization of topics, because people don't necessarily have an opinion, and then a politician that they follow or identify with says something, and then all of a sudden that topic becomes an issue. But before that, it's not really a problem. So that's consistent with what you found.
I'm not sure we found all of that. I think it's the big picture in the literature. For me, it's definitely that. Yeah. Wait, I had a thought when you started. Can you repeat just what you said at the start?
Yeah, just about how it's identity related and people, link to groups more than the actual content.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really what it's all about. I mean, a lot of stuff about humans when you study cognition comes back to our social drives. At our heart, we are really still social animals, hypersocial animals, and we care about either social reputation or belonging to a particular group. And I think with misinformation, it's probably both. There's this really interesting phenomenon, for example, of people who don't feel like they're part of the mainstream. They don't feel represented. They don't feel fairly treated. They're maybe frustrated with how their lives went. They feel excluded in a way. And they can find a kind of belonging in groups that have extremist beliefs. And to prove to these groups that they are part of these groups, they break bridges with the mainstream by claiming really extreme things on the internet. Like flat earthers might be an example. Most people know that if they publicly say that the world is flat, most other people will think they're stupid. And they do this to prove their loyalty and to gain reputation in the group for standing up against the mainstream. I think this is a nice example of this mix of reputation and belonging. We actually tried to use this in interventions against misinformation.
Just going to adjust your mic. Yeah.
Because at the start, when we set out to do the project, we were emotion and social identity experts, but we weren't misinformation experts. And so we were kind of still buying into this idea of misinformation makes people emotional. Then they stop thinking all that much, and then they just share stuff they haven't actually read, they haven't actually fact-checked, they haven't checked the source, and that might be part, this speeding up of the attention economy of social media, that might be part of the misinformation problem. But now I feel a bit stupid when I read that proposal for the project that got us the money, because as an emotion researcher, I feel like I should have known that emotions usually have a function in the specific situation. Sometimes they misguide our behavior, but by and large, they're intelligent, just not necessarily for what we want them to do in that specific situation. I think in the case of misinformation, emotions attract a lot of attention. They are what gets people's attention when stuff is about their social identities. But they're not actually, I don't believe that anymore, they're not actually manipulating people to believe stuff. So at the start, we thought we would just try to reduce emotions by asking people to maybe label the emotion they were feeling before sharing a piece of news or something like that. And we quickly moved away from that because we thought we should target really the social root causes. So that could be political polarization, low trust in the media, these kinds of things of misinformation. And so one intervention that was pretty successful, which is actually the work of Apeksha Shetty, one of the PhD students I worked with, used both the reputation and the belonging kind of motive by telling people, not even talking about misinformation, just telling people that beliefs in alternative medicine were really popular among the Nazis, and that the Nazis were against Jewish doctors who vaccinated people with poisonous materials. And the Nazis were really in favor of natural medicine, getting back to your, strong bodies will survive, and illness just makes the body stronger, that kind of thing. And that kind of thinking is still popular today among right-wing parties. And just giving people this piece of historical information makes them more skeptical of alternative medicines. We focused on alternative medicines because we thought it was a less polarized issue than vaccines. And still we know that anti-vaccine beliefs are strongly correlated with beliefs in alternative medicine. So often this is kind of an entry point. So I think they're really, people don't want to be part of a group that's Nazis. And also they really don't want to lose their reputation, right? They don't want to be seen as something like this. And so this worked across the political spectrum. I guess we didn't have any proper Nazis in the sample. It was a representative sample, but probably not large enough for that. And so even people really on the right end of the political spectrum didn't want to be associated with Nazis and reduced their belief in alternative medicines.
Yeah, which is quite interesting because then you tap into a belief that is, say, more prioritized in their beliefs network. You know, it's the belief of I don't want to be a Nazi or Nazis are bad.
Yes.
And I think that's a very wise sort of intervention because one of the things that you get is if you can tap into a belief that is more prioritized, you can usually get this cascade type of effect, which is kind of the inverse of what we're seeing. Or not the inverse, but we're seeing that on the other side as well, where people are, facilitated to believe this whole set of lies about, say, vaccines or the legitimacy of elections. But that's really not the beliefs that they hold that are prioritized. The more prioritized beliefs are institutions aren't trustworthy,
exactly.
and things are rigged. And so then those other beliefs are sort of auxiliary. They kind of come in for free.
Yeah, exactly. There's also really nice studies showing that how corrupt a country is correlated with the degree to which misinformation is spread in the country. And I think that's a real hint that there's good reason to disbelieve a government or a system that's corrupt. And I think that is really one of the causes of misinformation. I see it much more as a symptom of there being bigger societal problems, and that might be many that then lead citizens to distrust their governments. I think at least when we're talking about Western democracies, the perspective I'm currently talking about applies. I think it's a much more complicated picture, of course, when actually you can't trust the government. And I think it's a wholly different topic. Misinformation in Russia or China and so on, where people really don't know what to believe anymore because they probably know a lot of the information they get isn't good, but they will still be influenced by the information.
Yeah. They'll be influenced by information that appeals to the idea of corruption.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
That lack of institutional trust ends up being really huge.
Yeah.
And there's also this thing where when how I see it is there's one axis of institutional trust and there's another axis of how centralized you think the power is. So if you think the power is held among like 6 people or 10,000 people, it's a very different thing.
Yeah.
And you get the most extreme types of conspiracy theories where, 6 lizards are controlling the whole world.
Yeah.
Versus, there's a conspiracy, but it's with corporations and, more of a sort of neoliberal framework that, say, exploits nations and things like this. So I think that that's also a nuance there that is worth considering, and how you kind of measure the extremity of the conspiracy theory.
I guess also social inequality becomes bigger, right? The smaller the elite, and so there might be more and more reason to distrust the rich elite in your country. The smaller they are, not sure.
Yeah, I guess maybe if there's greater wealth inequality and high corruption in the country, then you get these sort of, there's just 3 people running the whole country kind of belief.
Yeah, so I think that all kind of relates to why we focus on emotions and social identity intervention. Another finding I want to mention that we saw throughout the last years in the literature, and that we also found. So Jula Lüring, the second PhD student in the project, she actually did a huge social media data collection over like 3 years of Twitter data before the API was shut down by Elon Musk. So most of the pandemic is covered from 2021 onwards or so. And she collected all kinds of Twitter discussions around tweets with the URL to any kind of online news source, from the lowest trustworthy, smallest websites that are part of the NewsGuard database, that's actually the database we use to measure trustworthiness, to really the biggest kind of, more famous online news sources in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So we always focused on German-speaking news. And she found really that the quantity of low trustworthy news, so here we're not focusing exclusively on definitely false information, so inaccurate information, but we're taking a pretty generous criterion of what we count as misinformation. And she found really that this the quantity of tweets that lead to news sources of low quality. I don't remember the exact number, but it was something like 5, 6, 7% of tweets. In other studies, sometimes that's even lower. Depending on what you look at, I think specific countries, specific social media, the percentage is sometimes a bit higher. And we know that the percentage rose during the pandemic, but we also know that actually the consumption of trustworthy news increased even more. So there was a huge just increase in information consumption, and mostly the high trustworthy news sources benefited. So we find this all over the place in all kinds of studies. Most of them are from the US, but we have some from other parts of the world. Consumption is actually low. And that's really surprising for a lot of people. I think it really points to what the actual problem with misinformation is. Most people don't have false beliefs because they saw some piece of misinformation that manipulated their belief. But most people hold false beliefs because they were not exposed to real or to accurate information, or they failed to believe accurate information. And so they're too skeptical rather than too gullible. And I think that's one other big takeaway from the research I did in the last 4 years on misinformation. People aren't stupid was kind of my personal takeaway. Maybe I should probably say people aren't gullible. People aren't so easy to influence. People are really active information seekers. They have a lot of false beliefs, and they look for information that confirms their existing beliefs. So again, we come back to the topic of social identity. I think this is also an area of research that we didn't do much on it, but we read a lot about algorithms influencing people, filter bubbles. To what extent is all of this social media's fault? And I think it's a big topic we could talk about. But I think really what we never should forget when we talk about algorithms, filter bubbles in social media and so on is people's active role in seeking out information that confirms, for example, their distrust of the government. And we know that the people who seek out misinformation, they're a pretty small percentage of the population. They're very visible on social media because they're really loud and extreme, but they're a really small percentage. So we're really talking about, in many studies, 1-2% of people making up for 80% of the engagement with misinformation. So it's a pretty skewed distribution.
Yeah, I think that tracks. And I think one of the problems is also that people are engaging in a way where they're angry with the content. And so that kind of content gets elevated a bit.
Yes.
So you see a lot of misinformation that has a lot of comments, and then you pass through and you don't really remember the content that you agree with because you've scrolled so much, and then one thing angers you out of 30 posts, and that's what sticks.
Yes.
And so there's that sort of effect.
Exactly. I think that it's really the main reason people share misinformation, or the main reason, one very important reason, is they want to show they're angry against the government or some other part of the system. It could be mainstream schools, mainstream media, mainstream medicine, or whatever. So really there is a lot of anger, and Eula found that also in her analysis of high trustworthy and low trustworthy news. There is a lot more anger around news than in general around social media posts. In general, there isn't that much anger. It's higher around news because news are something political, and politics is about social identity and so on. And the amount of anger is higher around misinformation. And there is even a small causal effect. So we try to control for all kinds of things that we could control for, like the emotion in the tweet that posts the news, like the number of followers of the person who posts. Eula had a lot of control variables. And then we looked using a causal matching approach. And we look at non-parametric matching, as you call it, where you select low quality and high quality news that are very similar on all the control variables. And like this, you create a control group and an experimental group. And then you can kind of approximate potential causal effects of misinformation. And we found actually a small effect of low quality news on anger in the ensuing discussions on social media. It's small, so I really think most of my hypothesis that I can't prove until now as an emotion researcher would be that mostly when there's angry postings, that will be reflected in angry responses. So I really think very often it's just anger causes anger, fear causes fear, and so on. But on top of this, there seems to be a small effect of low-quality news on angry discussions on social media.
Where the posters themselves can be angry
Yes.
at the institution they're posting against, but then the people who also disagree
Yes.
are also responding because they're
Yes.
angry. So you get this
Exactly.
cycle.
Exactly. Yeah, ideally, you'd want to control for the content of the news there, but that's really tough because you'd have to follow each link back to the source and then analyze anger in the online news piece. But then again, most people aren't actually reading the news, but just reading the tweet.
Yeah. I saw that a lot where just the article headline
Yeah.
generates so much response. Even if somebody reposts it just with the headline, they don't add any content to it. People seeing that who are already triggered by the content will respond.
Yes.
So I think one of the important things that you're pointing out is that it's the emotions that are already kind of tied to specific topics.
Yes.
And social media just provides that, not just an outlet, but a consistent reminder and way to engage with that emotion.
Yes.
And because the thing that kind of triggers us and is so manipulative is anger, it's not necessarily manipulating. I would say emotions aren't really manipulating our beliefs, but they are driving our behavior, which is kind of how I see and I think how you see emotions role anyway, even evolutionarily through the course of time.
Exactly.
This is what emotions are for, guiding our behavior. And so there is, I think, an important reclaiming of the role of emotions here, because how historically emotions were seen as something, when we use the term rationality, some people still are tied to the word rationality, which I'm not a fan of at all. But they would look at emotions as irrational. They would first define what isn't emotional. Everything else that was emotional was used usually in a very misogynistic way. And then all of a sudden emotions became this bad thing. You don't want to feel emotions and you have to keep emotions out. But really, like you said, there's a lot of intelligence in emotions.
Yes.
That's what they're there for.
Yes, exactly. I think emotions are really there to guide behavior. And of course, most of the behavior that needs guidance for humans is social behavior. So emotions are around misinformation. I think they are driven by our emotions drive our social behavior. So they might be part of the reasons why we share a specific piece of misinformation, because we're angry, because that thing that is claimed in the news runs counter our social identity, the beliefs we hold, the beliefs of the group we hold. And it's really about we think somebody's attacking our group, and therefore we get angry, and therefore we share the piece of information.
Can you go over a little bit more on kind of your views on social identity and the role here?
I need a question that's a bit more specific.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I see social identity as kind of one of the main things that it's the interface through which we kind of deal with the world, you know, and everything that we deal with, we kind of either attach to ourselves, or stay ambivalent about, or actively kind of repel. And it seems like emotions, the gradient of emotion that we experience, to me seems like the distance between what we accept with our social identities is consistent. And the distance between what we accept and what we see in the world kind of generates either a positive emotion if we see that confirmed, our social identity confirmed, and a strong negative emotion if we see that rejected. And not to kind of oversimplify emotions, but I do think that there is a sort of single, like there's a core gradient, a central gradient that you can draw of this sort of positive and negative affect, which is based upon how much what I see is what I expect, or how much what I see is what I identify with. Yeah.
Emotions as a signal of where reality deviates from what your brain expected, for sure. Yeah, I think what plays a big role in this misinformation topic is really identity threat. That we really see somebody attacking our group, and that feels like it's attacking us. And that's why these topics feel so politicized, and that's why it's so hard to actually convince anybody around these topics, because really they feel their identity, who they are, or their group is being criticized.
I think one of the things to me that sticks out about social media,
yeah,
one of the potential issues is we can change our identities over time.
Yes.
we kind of allow ourselves to change, even if we don't allow others to change. We kind of try to hold other people to what we think they should be, but we give ourselves the kind of freedom. But one of the things that we need to change is temporal distance from the last time we were angry about something. If I'm every day defending my
belief around vaccines.
Yeah,
or
my
whatever.
belief around vaccines, then it's never going to change.
Yeah.
And I think if a couple of years pass, and I saw this a lot with different friends in terms of people who had vaccine hesitancy or people who in the United States weren't necessarily supportive of movements like Black Lives Matter, I saw the distance generate a lot more opinion change.
Yeah.
When we weren't arguing about it all the time.
Yeah.
And maybe one of, I guess, my fears about social media is that this doesn't give us that space.
Yes, I actually think that's one of the few things I would actually blame social media for. They constantly make these conflicts between different societal groups very, very salient. The media, not just social media, the media has always used emotions, negative emotions, fear, anger, as a way to attract attention. And now this is kind of in hyperdrive on social media because we have so much competition between different sources of information that we need to kind of use emotions to get people's attention. And then the most emotional, the most negative, the most surprising content on social media attracts most attention, not just by people on social media, but even the media, the general media, then focus on these groups that create the most noise on social media. And so on social media, we really, and this is largely Chris Bale's perspective on what social media does, social media is really a perfect platform to make radical, loud, extreme voices very visible and to make moderate opinions that are on many topics, a large proportion of the population agrees on, they're very invisible because people who are not so sure about climate change, vaccines, whatever, or who don't care all that much because they're busy living their own lives, they prefer just watching entertainment on social media or something like this, they don't talk about these topics. And they also have very low incentives to talk about these topics because if they do, they will probably very quickly get attacked by more extreme people. So really, moderates become invisible on social media. And I think this is how social media probably makes polarization worse than it would be without social media. So I really still don't think that social media are a cause of polarization. I think for that you need real societal problems. But I really think it's true that social media accelerates this because through emotions, through visibility of radical opinions, it makes society seem more polarized than it actually is. Chris Bale calls this false polarization. So it creates this view that we're more polarized than we actually are, and that creates then effective polarization, hate towards other groups in society, and that makes it increasingly hard to communicate across boundaries between different social groups.
Yeah, as what we perceive as the distance increases, then we get a bigger problem because there are all these findings of how we see our in-groups as very dynamic, very different, multitudinous, heterogeneous, but of course the out-group is homogeneous, a mob, unintelligent, incapable. And so this dehumanization that takes place is a big problem. And a lot of people, like you said, the majority is kind of kept in the middle and they become increasingly disinterested, which is a huge problem in terms of democracy when people are just not wanting to discuss, not wanting to read, not wanting to engage with the news because it's so filled with antagonism. Yeah.
And because in addition, we have this big narrative about the news and social media containing so much false news.
Right.
And so people disengage even more. So I really think that there's much more room, although it's harder probably, but there's much more room to improve people's trust in the media, in society in general, to improve institutions. So people actually trust institutions to make sure institutions actually represent all parts of a population. These are the hard solutions for the misinformation problem, but I think there's much more room there because most people believe false stuff because they're skeptical or because it's part of their social identity. So they're part of a group that has reason in some way or another to distrust the system, and therefore they go around spreading false information.
Yeah, it seems that when people feel their social identity is devalued or when they feel ostracized, then they're more willing to take on conspiratorial beliefs.
Yes.
And we have sort of decades at this point of findings of when you are threatened in terms of your position in a group, or when you feel like your group is threatened, then you kind of take these catch-all type of conspiracy theories of the government is against us, corporations are running everything. Of course, in there are some accurate pieces of information. We know when corporations have funded studies in the past. But then it seems like the more extreme conspiracy theories, because a lot of people, I know a lot of people that don't even think of these as conspiracy theories because they've normalized so much things like vaccine hesitancy and how evil all pharmaceutical companies are and agricultural companies, and they're not ready to kind of engage critically with the parts that might be questionable and the parts that might be beneficial to society. But then, and that group doesn't really think of themselves as conspiracy theorists when they say, Pfizer is an evil corporation that's just out to kill, and they probably have cancer cures and things like that.
Yeah.
This type of. But then there's the layer further of flat Earth and microchipping in the vaccines and things like that, and it seems like that is adopted not necessarily by large groups, but by individuals who are very ostracized.
Yes.
Might be feeling alone in their social environment.
Yes.
And what you get when you mentioned this before too, is what you get online is a high reward from a flat Earth group if you become a flat earther.
Yes.
Because they're already a marginalized group, and adopting their belief, of course they're going to pat you on the back, and nobody celebrates you for accepting the world is round.
Yes.
But you will get celebrated for accepting the world is flat.
Yeah, you finally find a group that you're part of and you're not socially excluded anymore. I think it's also the reason for which it's so hard for people to leave these groups. Because they lost their links to other people in society. And then it's also obvious that, I think I wouldn't leave such a group if it was my only actual social contact, if all my relationships were part of that group. Yeah, actually, you said before that these people don't see themselves as conspiracy theorists. And I think that's very, very often true. Really, these people often, they're very skeptical. They see themselves as truth seekers. So they're very, they don't, they think you shouldn't trust any kind of information, but you need to check everything yourself. And these kinds of people are usually more likely to believe in misinformation rather than people who go around just trusting the media. So it's really, we get back to kind of what I think the actual cause, it's still a cause at a superficial level of misinformation is. It's really low trust in the media. It's skepticism rather than gullibility and just believing everything you see on the internet.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most difficult parts is the low institutional trust.
Yes.
Because you can get to a point where validation is incredibly powerful.
Yes.
Like not just validation of your physical self, but validation of your beliefs, which I think is a very powerful thing. So, I mean, we know this from, Arthur Ashe the Ashe studies from the 50s, where they're just judging the length of line segments, and then the participants found the other people who agreed with them on the length of the line segment to be nicer, more intelligent people. But we see this on social media all the time.
Yes.
If somebody agrees with you in a comment war that you don't even know, all of a sudden you feel affinity towards this person. Yes. And that's this strange sort of thing, but that's wired in. So I think to me, interventions of the sort need to be validating. They need to be sort of a yes and conversation. But it's very hard to touch on this when we talk about degraded institutional trust. And I'm sure there are ways to carry that conversation. We can say yes, there's a lot of corruption. Yes, there's this. However, this.
Yeah.
But it's very difficult when people begin to even doubt the same, doubt all the sources.
Yes.
So if we have no sources that we can agree on, then the information becomes very difficult.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess, what are your thoughts on that? I just want to put that to you.
Validation is actually one of the things we thought about when developing interventions. We did a small pilot study. And I don't remember exactly, but I think it had the opposite result of what we were expecting. So we were looking for a little video, some way of validating people's worries about, I think in that case, was it vaccines or was it also alternative medicines? I don't remember exactly. Because I think people often, they have a lot of valid concerns around drugs, for example. Drugs have side effects, right? It's true that big pharma, also that there's issues there. There is lobbying there. So there's different reasons for which people might distrust modern medicine, including vaccines. And we tried to actually measure these different we called them root causes of people's disbelief, and then to validate these concerns, to actually say, you're right to look for experiments that don't have harmful, for drugs that don't have harmful side effects, especially when you give them to your kid. It's really, really natural to worry about your kid. So we try to do this kind of validation to then see if people would afterwards be more open-minded to read a scientific piece about homeopathy or something like that. And then I think the video was too nice. The video we showed them was too nice, and they believed in homeopathy even more or something like that. And we decided for the time of the project, it was too complicated to figure out a way to validate people's emotions. It's much easier to just ask people to pay attention to the source or to give them a quick fact check or something like that. That's quick and easy online. I think validation, I'm not sure it might work online, but people need to be validated, need to be motivated to listen to you long enough for you to be able to validate their concerns. To say, yeah, I really get why you're angry at the government. There's all these true societal problems that we really need to solve, and we're really not doing a good job. But it's also hard to solve these problems. I don't think the chips, Bill Gates, whoever is to blame. I think this needs time, and you need high communication skills and a lot of time, a couple of hours with a person to manage to change their way, to change their mind in this way. I think, changing minds is hard. This is also really interesting. I'm doing a bit of a jump now to the persuasion literature. When we look at the effect of political ads or the effect of ads in general, effects are usually very small. So you need to spend a lot of money to actually change people's minds. And this is also the reason why some of the misinformation around, for example, Trump's election had very little effect. So I think people are often worried about Russia influencing what people saw on social media. Sometimes Cambridge Analytica is mentioned in this context of the Trump election, of the first one. And it's true that this kind of misinformation existed. It's also true that it reached people, but it mostly reached people who were already very convinced Trump supporters for all the reasons we've talked about. They were alienated. They were frustrated with society. They weren't trusting the system anymore. And so these people really engaged the most with misinformation, Russian disinformation bots and so on. And therefore, misinformation had very small causal effects. Yeah, so from validation back to persuasion. Persuasion is hard. I think it's possible. But we've talked before, not in the podcast, but actually in the conversation we had a couple of days ago, about when persuasion does work. So I think that's always important to keep in mind. Of course, it's hard to change somebody's opinion, but it's not so hard to pick up fears that people have and to kind of surface beliefs people already have, like them distrusting the government, and to misuse that as part of political propaganda. I'm much less an expert on that kind of topic, but changing minds in terms of opinion is very hard with misinformation. I'm not sure that means it's hard to influence behavior overall. Although there's also studies showing that the effects of misinformation are really kind of small for vaccines, for example. But even if it's small, it might be important, I think, especially at the margin when you have, like in the US, really in the end, a few voters decide which party is going to govern the country for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think when you have situations where there's only two choices, then this is a much bigger problem, because the ads need to affect 3-4% of the population at most, which is an insignificant portion of the population if you're running a study. That wouldn't cause any significant effects at all.
Yes.
But in the American system, of course, there's plenty.
In the right state, that might actually
exactly, especially in the right states when you subdivide it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's very much the case that anywhere in the world, people are ready to accept that an election is rigged when their side loses.
Yes.
And this is also the difficult thing. When you have many different parties, you can have more nuance. But if it's just two every time your election loses, if people keep peddling this problem, then people start believing it. I know people on both sides that accept a lot of things that have been disproven about foreign meddling in U.S. elections. And I think that carries because, one side wins for one or two elections and the other side wins for one. So you're never more than 8 years away from
the last
potentially believing this, and this is one of the issues.
Yeah, for sure.
So we touched upon, I think, every point that we talked about before in terms of the myths of misinformation, the myths. But if you could kind of explicitly go over a couple that you're thinking so people don't have to infer them. What are some of the myths that you...
Yeah, the first one I always start with is emotions don't make people stupid.
Right.
And the same is true for emotions around misinformation. Then the quantity of misinformation is really much lower than we think. Always below 10% in every study I've seen so far in Western democracies. Again, important constraint. Then we have this kind of assumption that everybody sees misinformation on social media, and it's actually a very skewed distribution. So most of the engagement with misinformation is really centered on a very small part of the population, especially when we talk about sharing. Then a myth is people believe false things because of social media, because of misinformation, misinformation specifically is very popular on social media always. And I think that's wrong. I think people have a lot of misperceptions, but it's not because of misinformation. It's because of root causes like low trust in the education system, in the media, in the government, and it's because people are too skeptical rather than too gullible. They don't believe stuff easily because their beliefs are tied to their social identities. Then there's the myth that we just touched upon when talking about advertisements, that information, ads, misinformation has a large effect on behavior. It usually doesn't, because it's mostly consumed by people who look for this kind of information, who already believe this. It's a huge partisan issue. And it therefore usually has very small effects on behavior. But again, there I always need to make the constraint that I really don't know in the context of propaganda, if you use misinformation to surface beliefs people already have, you might have a large effect on behavior. Just because you make these kinds of beliefs okay to have. I think it's probably in Hugo Mercier's book where he gives this example of anti-Semitic actions at the start of the Second World War were highest in areas of Germany where there was already a lot of anti-Semitism beforehand. And when Hitler came along and the propaganda came along, they felt legitimized to attack Jews. And that's where this actually happened. So most people didn't necessarily become anti-Semitic. Often, especially in authoritarian regimes, it's enough that you will go to prison, that you will die or something like that, for you to not claim that you're not anti-Semitic, for example, anymore. So most people weren't necessarily anti-Semitic. Some people were. And these were the ones that actively engaged the most. So I think in that sense, misinformation and propaganda can influence behavior, but not by changing minds.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important points, is that the more prioritized beliefs are not things that are being changed, but we can attach specific beliefs to them.
Yes.
And I think that's the problem.
Yeah.
Like, I do think that the misinformation around the microchip is what made people believe in the microchip, but those are already people who believed a vaccine wasn't safe.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that that's what people miss.
Yes.
Is because, yeah, of course, everybody wasn't going to settle on exactly Bill Gates and microchip in the vaccine. That'd be ridiculous to assume, because it's such an outrageous sort of random selection of things. But they're all the people that were going to be hesitant of the vaccine in the first place, and this just gives them something specific.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that that's one thing that makes people want to believe that misinformation itself is the problem, because, like you said, it becomes so rapid. And I think the pace of things is magnified on social media. But we've had misinformation. People were burning witches. People were burning, not witches, people were burning human beings and claiming that they were witches, right? And then people were attacking minorities during the plague, believing that the minorities were spreading plagues. Yeah. So all of this type of thing existed, but it's the specifics and the pace which seems to be frightening. But we ought to, like you're saying, disentangle these two things, because then we might be worried about the wrong aspect.
Yes, I think we're going to try to fight the problem in the wrong way.
Right.
So I think with regard to misinformation, I think it's really important to fight harmful misperceptions. I don't really care where they come from, and I'm pretty convinced most of the time they don't come from misinformation on social media. I think actually the vaccine example you talked about with the chip is a really nice example for people already having a lot of false beliefs. So the natural state of human beings is not having accurate information about the world. That's really not where we come from. Like you mentioned burning witches. I think if you go back to our ancestral past, we probably believe the stars were gods. The trees had spirits, all kinds of things, right? We really come from a place of not knowing how the world works. And in a certain sense, education, science were really, really successful because we have a lot more correct beliefs about the world today than we did in the Middle Ages or in our ancestral past. And some of the false beliefs we have make a lot of sense given our intuitive understanding of the world. And I think vaccines is such an example. Where it's easy to explain why a lot of people are hesitant to vaccinate themselves or their kids, although the misinformation is not the problem. And I think it's very intuitive that it could be harmful to get some kind of dead virus or bacterium put into your body under your skin. It's very intuitive to believe that might be harmful. And that you have lots of reason to be careful and to not just trust the first person that comes along to inject you with something. So this trust here is probably kind of healthy. It's just that by now we understand scientifically how disease happens. And luckily, most people in Western democracies trust science and trust education and the medical system enough to actually get vaccinated. Right. And so if you look at the problem of misperceptions are the problem, science education are the solution, misinformation is just a symptom, it's not the cause of these false perceptions, then it becomes very easy to understand how there are so many wrong beliefs. People seem so stupid, but actually they're not gullible. It's not just because they read a piece of information on the internet, but often there's valid concerns behind their misguided beliefs.
Yeah, and one of the things is, I think the burden comes on part of our education and part of the narrative of around what natural means and what a chemical is.
Yes.
I mean, the fact that all of us are chemistry, it seems to be completely lost.
Yes.
Right, and people are waging this war on chemicals, which is completely ridiculous, considering that's what we are.
Yeah.
But that seems to be a big gap. Like one thing that I see gaining a lot of momentum is this sort of naturalist, like you mentioned, naturalist movement, where people alternative medicine and
yoga.
Every time they see something that has a name that they don't know in an ingredient list,
yes,
it's an enemy. But if you break down the ingredient list and just give all the chemical names instead of the common names of things, it's just a chemistry list. I mean, that's what it's for. But I think that this somehow gets lost.
Yeah, it gets lost. And people forget that there's lots of natural stuff that's very poisonous.
Of course.
That's the name of the red mushrooms with the white dots in English.
Yeah, Amanita muscaria.
Yeah. This really gets lost to people.
Yeah.
I guess it's one of those intuitive biases that make a lot of sense. Just chemicals, stuff we can see, bacteria, viruses, radiant. Do you call it radiance?
Like radiation?
People, radiation. Yeah. People are really afraid of stuff they can't see.
Yes.
Invisible stuff.
Yeah, 5G
that might harm
towers
them.
and
and so on.
It probably comes from this history of poisoning and things like that. Which is people grinding up plants, which are bad for you, and then but somehow something gets lost in this idea, and they're like, oh, well, this thing is poison because it must be a chemical. Yeah,
I don't have an example, but these things happened, right? They're really, when we quickly became industrialized and we figured out new compounds with which we could make plastic and so on, sometimes harm really happened. Most of the time, we caught it a couple of years later. Some people were harmed. So I think, again, their concerns are valid to a certain degree, but then to distrust everything that's chemical and not natural because of that will probably often lead people astray. So it's complicated and nuanced.
Yeah, it's this negativity bias.
Yes.
Is that people are ready to say, well, this bad thing happened in the past with this thing, and I think it's a gateway that a lot of people used. I've heard a lot of, well, I would trust the COVID vaccines, but they were just pushed too fast. And I wish they were tested more. And that's where my skepticism... And people feel like that's a reasonable set of things to claim.
Yeah.
But of course, they're ignoring so much. And it's just an easy way to kind of facilitate this is, remember last time that happened? But it's like 1 out of 1,000 times when something not trustworthy comes out.
Yeah, and it's often people they lack specific pieces of information, right? Yeah. And again, it's a lack of exposure to the information they needed that makes them distrust vaccines. I think a good example here is this. The studies were too quick. People didn't hear anybody explain why studies are much quicker now, because now we have so many people who are infected by COVID. And so it's much, much easier to very quickly do huge studies, which otherwise aren't possible. It's just possible because it's the pandemic, or that the mRNA technology had been developed for so many years, right? And luckily, we could quickly adopt it for COVID-19 vaccines. So there's so much information people didn't get. And then again, it makes sense to just distrust a study that was done so quickly.
Yeah. And there's also this problem of when you publish something that is accurate, you don't keep publishing the same thing.
Oh.
But misinformation can vary slightly, take many forms, and every day you can publish a new misinformation, and then just put it out. And so
easy.
For people who are following it, they're just inundated every day with something new. But we don't get inundated with accurate news of the same thing, because there's plenty of accurate news. You don't need to keep saying
so many accurate news to be
it's
informed
Tuesday,
about.
vaccines are still safe. It's Wednesday, vaccines are still safe.
Maybe a good topic to get back to that we just quickly mentioned at some point is algorithms, filter bubbles, because many people have worries about this. And we were worried too at the start of the project. So we wanted to look at how algorithms that learn mostly from what is popular on social media, these algorithms will, of course, pick up emotions and emotionalized content. and that could somehow bias the entire information ecosystem towards misinformation. And then I think we're pretty lucky by now. 10 years ago, we had no clue what algorithms actually did on social media. And still, we don't have much clue. But we have a few really high quality studies on actually changing algorithms on Instagram or Facebook. We have some really smart studies using bots on YouTube and so on. And overall, I was really surprised to see that most of these studies don't find any effects. So to give just one example, algorithms on Facebook and Instagram were changed during 3 months during the 2020 election in the US. A huge sample of Facebook users. I think all Facebook users that were active in a specific time window before the election, and they were active often enough, got invited to the study. Many participated. And then the algorithm was changed for 3 months to present less like-minded content. So less content from sources you already agree with. Because people, we know that, do consume a lot of information from like-minded sources. And this was done for 3 months. And that the most important outcome variables were effective polarization. So how much do you hate the other side? Issue polarization, polarization of opinions. They also measured stuff like belief in misinformation, how much political news do people get, how good is their knowledge about political news, and so on. And big surprise, this didn't influence opinions or effective polarization. Not a little bit. Really huge sample, so you can very precisely estimate an effect size of 0. And it was really 0. And then you can kind of start looking for explanations of why that might be, and there are many, and this points to all the things we still don't know. Of course, the US is already a very polarized country. Maybe if you have such a polarized country, and then people just don't see polarized news as much anymore on Facebook for 3 months, this is not enough to have an effect. Maybe it's really a thing that develops over years. Then what else could you say? It was just Facebook or just Instagram. People still consumed all of these other news throughout the election period. I still kind of find it surprising that there was really no effect. I felt like if algorithms were this powerful tool that we often are afraid they are, then we should have seen something, a little bit. And then in addition to this come studies on the algorithm, for example, on Google, where we look at where people looked at how big the effect is of the algorithm compared to the search terms people put in. And the search terms people put in is much, much, much larger. Of course, if you Google Bill Gates and microchip or something, you're going to find misinformation. The Google algorithm is going to have much less of an effect than what you actively look for. In addition to that, we have YouTube studies, for example, studies that just use a bot to always click on the next recommendation of the YouTube algorithm. And they look at what happens over time. Does consumption get more radical or less radical? And on average, the algorithm leads people to mainstream content, which makes sense because all of these algorithms are trained with what the majority of the users like, and the majority of the users aren't radical. But now, of course, if you start consuming radical content on YouTube, the algorithm can pick that up, and it can lead you down the rabbit hole. But so I think it's really, we often use these passive terms like falling into the rabbit hole, and people just get, I don't know what the term is, but we get manipulated by social media. And I think that's not true. People really jump into the rabbit hole and they dig, they actively look for this. Another one of these big Facebook studies that didn't look on algorithm effects, but that really looked at the size of people's echo chambers or filter bubbles, found that the algorithm does make people's news consumption more, extreme or one-sided. But on top of this, people really, they themselves really look for groups that post content that they agree with. if you turn off the algorithm, so there's one study that just used the reverse chronological algorithm, which is basically you turn the algorithm off and you just show people what was recently posted by one of the people they follow. If you do that, people really actively look for content that the algorithm doesn't present to them anymore. They used Facebook pages much more and Facebook groups and so on. So I think algorithms learn from our behavior and they might present radical stuff to radical people. I think it's really rare that somebody who has a moderate opinion gets swayed by an algorithm. But it's much more, again, that people actively look for misinformation and then the algorithm makes that maybe a little bit worse, right? By reinforcing the filter bubbles even further. And for filter bubbles, I generally also notice that people assume this total filter bubble effect or something on social media. They think we are in a total filter bubble. We don't consume anything from outside our opinion spectrum anymore. And that's not true. So these large studies on Facebook users in the US, they found that, yes, around 25% of people or so, it might be 20, but it's somewhere in this range, they are in what we would consider a filter bubble or echo chamber. So like 70 or 80% of the news they consume comes from like-minded sources. But that's 25% of people. Then we have 25% of people or something like that on the other side of the spectrum who actually consume 75% of sources from non-like-minded sources. And most of the people are somewhere in the middle, right? Where we consume some information from like-minded sources, but not all of it. And I think on top of this, it's always really important to say that news and political news make up for a really small portion of people's information diet. And we're, again, talking about, 3%, something like that. So most of the stuff we do online is entertainment, porn, games, whatever. But most people don't spend their days browsing political news, including misinformation on social media. So I still think that there might be a way to use algorithms to make the problem a little bit less bad. I don't think that algorithms are the cause of the problem. I think they might accelerate it, similar to the conversation about social media and polarization. And by and large, we just see human nature play out in a really nasty way on social media, because social media allows that also. And we could maybe use the design of social media and the design of algorithms to make some of the human biases a little bit less bad, to maybe even turn them around, right? But since I've seen these studies, I don't think we'll have these huge effects anymore. Maybe algorithms can be little nudges in a positive direction, and along with many other nudges, we might create a more positive online information environment. But I'm really not sure. But I think we should try.
Yeah, I definitely think it's worth trying. Because I'm one of those people who engages with a lot of political information. And using something like Blue Sky has been greatly beneficial for just engaging with the type of content that I want. And I think that that's really nice. Maybe it's something like building your own filter bubble, but it is a different experience, right?
Yeah.
But I want to get back to the point you mentioned of people jumping down the rabbit hole, just because there's so much evidence supporting that, aside from what you cited as well in terms of the study. But there's so many studies that show that people will actively look for information, and they will that confirms what they believe, right? And actively ignore information that is disconfirming. So it's not just that we are looking for information we believe with, we agree with, but it is that our exposure to information is then skewed in one way. And I think that changes the problem a little bit, right? It's that our exposure, the amount of things we see and that we know about are completely skewed. and we're ignorant of what other people are thinking and feeling on the other side, which I think is also a big problem.
Yeah.
And there's, for example, one site, Verity. It's a group of actually academics that came together. It used to be called Improve the News, and Verity, with every article, shows you the bias. And there's, I think, Ground Views as well that does that. But and they give you write-ups of what the left, the right, and a neutral party would think of a. And I think that's quite nice.
Yeah.
I always agree with one of them, but it's nice to see what is going on, what the discussion is. And I think that helps us have a bit of nuance. Okay, I completely disagree with the basis of this opinion, but at least I see what people are thinking.
Yeah.
And I think that there's empathy there because it shows the concerns that other people have. And a lot of times our concerns might be the same.
Yeah.
Somebody who, like myself and an anti-vaxxer, the thing we have in common is that we want people to be safe and healthy.
Yes.
And I think that that's the thing that we lose.
Yes, totally. I think that's one thing also that researchers are trying to do with algorithms already. They're trying to use algorithms that find things people agree on. Like posts, for example, that both sides of an opinion spectrum have interacted with, and to push those posts to make more visible what people actually have in common. Another way of using algorithms to kind of get these groups with different opinions closer to each other, to understand each other's viewpoints, is algorithms that make small steps that kind of present something that's still close enough to your opinion to make you interested in it, but that has a little bit of the other perspective. And maybe like this, you can kind of guide people in small steps to understand why the other group has an opinion that seems so completely stupid to you, as long as you don't understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, I think every belief is a gateway to another set of beliefs that are adjacent to it on either side.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's the really interesting thing is if we can capitalize on this a bit more and allow individuals to have exposure to something that is just marginally different, but in either direction, then they can have sort of a better sense of what's going on around them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think because you mentioned Blue Sky, a really cool thing that we could do with social media, I have no idea if there's research on it already, is to let people choose a little bit what they want their algorithm to prioritize. I think Facebook did a small study many years ago already. I have a faint memory, where they asked people to rate content as good for the world or bad for the world. And then they showed people, they used an algorithm that showed people more content that people considered good for the world. And people liked that, but also engagement went down. I think the number of Facebook sessions, people logged in less often. And so Facebook kept a little bit of that, but didn't do too much of it because it was bad for their business model. So, but these kinds of things where you maybe even have different feeds that focus on different kind of values or interests you have, and you don't necessarily, when you go online for a bit of entertainment, you have these politicized postings every now and then interrupting you and attracting your attention with a lot of anger. But maybe you can just choose to have different feeds and to just look at your entertainment feeds and cute little cats or whatever. So I think giving people more choice might be a way forward. Again, I'm not sure. Often when you give people choice, they like fast food, right? They eat fast food, although it's not healthy. So I'm not sure it would actually be a solution, but it would be interesting to experiment with.
Yeah, it's one of these things where if you think about how often you check your text messages if everything's fine, it's completely different from if things are not fine. If you're in an argument or somebody's not safe. And this is just the environment that social media is able to create.
Yes.
I posted something angrily on somebody's post, and I'm waiting to see if they respond, and if they respond, then I'm going to type out another angry response. And it's a very sort of cynical position that social media companies have taken.
Yes. Because
they just care about entertainment. They just care about engagement.
Yeah.
It's true if it's a language learning platform or if it's social media, it's the same thing. It's just they want your attention.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the roles here is to, as researchers, to kind of put the attention on attention, right? Rather than on all these problems that are sort of invented or panics are created about them. It's actually where you're putting your attention and how your attention is manipulated more than the substance and the content itself.
Yeah, I entirely agree. But I think that's a really hard challenge in a way, right? How do you, if it's easy to make money using social media, they really fully play with this attention economy, negative emotions, hate speech, and so on. I don't know, do we need regulation to get out of this? Do we need public platforms that are made in a different way? Will these public platforms stand a chance of surviving? Because you will probably earn less money if you don't use the same attention economy. I think these are really tough questions. We might figure it out as humanity. I think often there were big worries around new technologies in the start. And then in the end, maybe sometimes these technologies had negative effects. I'm not sure. But we kind of managed to survive. It could be that we managed to do the same thing with social media. I'm not sure, right? It could also be that really this time, because it's so pervasive, we have our phones with us the entire day, that really this impact on attention fragmentation and so on has more serious consequences than other technologies had. I don't know. But I do think if it's so obvious, in the long run, we will probably figure out ways of dealing with it and of regulating it.
Yeah. And I think part of the regulation has to be not just in the platforms themselves, but in everything beyond the platforms.
Yes.
Make sure people have good, robust social, in-person social networks.
Yeah.
And time to do that.
Yeah.
And one of the problems if you're trying to struggle to make a living is the only thing you do to socialize is open your social media.
Yes.
Then that's a huge part of the problem itself.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, this touches upon groups who might be more vulnerable to potentially negative effects of social media. It's probably people who are already not that well off. It's probably kids who are already kind of socially neglected, don't have a good support system. Maybe their mental health is already bad. These are going to be the ones that are most vulnerable to potentially negative effects of social media, I think. So, kind of similar debate probably around mental health in parallel to the debate around misinformation. Who are the people who engage most with misinformation? It's the people who really already distrust the system and feel like society has failed them. And there's probably a similar story to tell around mental health and social media.
Yeah. Do you want to touch on any more agent-based modeling work, or do you feel like we covered most of the results on there?
I can touch on it a little bit. So this is work by Apeksha Shetty as well. And she basically took data from US politicians and analyzed news sharing between politicians. And she modeled really beautifully how emotions in the news increase or decrease news sharing by politicians. The focus on politicians was because we wanted to move away from looking at the broad population with regard to misinformation. We think it makes much more sense to focus on people like influencers or politicians who reach broad audiences. And she actually managed to have a model that really beautifully incorporated emotions, other temporal dynamics of how often do politicians log in, how often do they read stuff by other politicians, how often do they share it, and so on. All of this she could really model beautifully. Our aim was, in the end, to test algorithmic interventions. So, what if we use an algorithm that downgrades angry posts, for example? What if we use an algorithm that makes news from trustworthy sources more popular, and so on? And there we bumped into a bit of a problem. This is a real nice future direction, I think, for anybody who wants to work on this. We have this nice model now that explains real social media data really well, but also kind of confirming what we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, misinformation sharing was really low. And so we couldn't really, we had ceiling effects all over the place. We really couldn't find effects of these algorithmic interventions because there wasn't enough misinformation in our data. So there also, again, I think one would have to focus much more selectively on the small proportion of politicians who are actually creating most of the engagement with misinformation. And then maybe if you get data from these kinds of politicians to fine-tune our model with that kind of data, then you could probably test algorithmic interventions. So for now, we have a beautiful model, works really well, but none of the algorithmic interventions had any effect.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, we also find this even in bias literature, where this is some of the work that I do, but the effects are always significant. Yeah. We always find obviously huge effects of personal bias, the beliefs that you bring into an information space determine the information you'll engage with, but there's always a significant portion of the population that isn't biased.
Yes.
It's that in between the two treatment groups, there is a significant difference. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times, a majority of the population, just a simple majority, at the very least, is engaging in a way that is not as biased. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's very important to keep in mind, because when we talk about the findings in the literature of how biased our information consumption is, there's still a significant portion that this is not changing the way that they engage with information. So there's a lot of hope there. Yeah. And I think that all we do is focus on the negative aspects of it, which then make us more pessimistic or cynical, or think that people are inherently stupid or inherently
democracy
bad.
Is lost because of social media or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whereas, like we kind of touched on earlier, most of the things driving people's beliefs are because they want a good outcome.
Yes.
And if we are able to focus on that, I think it's a much more hopeful future.
Yeah, totally. Even in general, I think if we manage to really focus on the big proportion of the population where we don't have problems, and to focus on the problem maybe the large population really has. I think with regard to misinformation, that this would mean focusing on increasing interest in politics, on increasing trust in the media, on good education, on good, robust science. I think that's probably a more productive way forward than focusing on the small radical or problematic groups or biased groups. Although that might often also be necessary. I think with regard to the radical groups that spread misinformation, I think we need to do stuff there, but we shouldn't give them as much attention as we do today, because I don't think it helps the actual problem.
Yeah, right on. Is there anything else you want to touch on in sort of your research work? Because you've also shifted the focus of your work recently into more therapy. Do you want to talk more about that as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about like the shift from the academic world to the non-academic world. Right. If there's listeners out there who kind of think about this a lot too, it's very recent for me. So I only started a new job as a psychologist, actually a clinical psychologist in training at a psychosocial rehabilitation center 2 months ago. So that's a center where people go for 6 weeks if they have a psychological problem that's considered serious enough for them to like take a 6-week break from their jobs. So this is mostly people with burnout, depression, panic disorders, anxiety disorders, sleep disorders. Addiction is separate in Austria, so there's separate rehabilitation centers for people with alcohol problems and the like. I am worried about leaving academia for a long time, and this might change. That's why I said it's only very recent for me. But for now, I really enjoy my new job. It's very rewarding compared to science, where you write papers for years and you revise and revise and revise. And no matter how good you are, there's always somebody who's better than you are and has more publications, more talks, more whatever. A day-to-day job where you interact with people. Or I think many jobs actually have rewards at a much higher at much higher intervals than scientists get rewards. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's even research showing that people often hesitate a lot between making these kind of career changes, and that more often than not, they're actually happy in hindsight and pretty quickly. And for me, this is definitely true. Yeah, it kind of relates to the work I did, right? Not necessarily with regard to misinformation, but all the emotion work, mental health, suicide prevention. It's really useful in my current job. And I noticed that patients really appreciate my knowledge. So it feels really like there when I'm talking about the neuroscience of sleep or something, it really helps people. They're super grateful. And for me, that's really beautiful. I think I really needed that after many years of already kind of feeling and knowing that I wouldn't continue being an academic, but never really daring to make the step. Also, probably because I just wanted to be there for the PhD students until the end of the project and so on. Yeah, but if I could talk to my past self, let's say like, don't know, 2 years ago, I would really tell myself to go unemployed immediately and then things will work out. If I could talk to my past self even more years ago, maybe I would even tell myself to not continue doing a postdoc after my PhD. I'm not sure. I also really enjoyed some of the things in the last year. So it was nice to do podcasts, for example. I enjoyed giving presentations to the public. I enjoyed interactions with colleagues a lot in science. I think I'll miss having a lot of smart people around me. But I'll find ways of doing that anyway, I guess. Yeah, so overall for me, it was a really positive experience so far.
Yeah, and what is the work like?
Very, very social. So I used to, like many other people, I think in science, to sometimes fight with procrastination, where you had to, you really need to be very disciplined and very motivated to get yourself to finally write that article. And the work now is really, this is just a non-issue. From day one on, it was a non-issue. The patient's just there at your door, and then you have that conversation, and then you figure out a way of doing it, and you realize you actually did quite well. Often I get positive feedback by patients. So I do different kinds of things. I actually have single clients. I usually only do 2 sessions with them there at the beginning and at the end of their rehabilitation stay. I have groups of patients that I see 10 times over the 6-week period, where we talk about different topics from sleep to how to deal with their disorders, to self-motivation, to emotions, to resilience, these kinds of topics. Then I give talks on all kinds of psychological topics. I do relaxation groups. These were exciting the first 2 times, then not so much anymore, but I find them really relaxing. So like if I do a relaxation group once per day, I become very relaxed myself. Yeah, so overall it's just very, very social, very much interactive, and rewarding on a much higher basis. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess to slowly wrap it up, what drove you towards the work that you started in academia that I guess you're kind of able to continue now? You sort of touched on the rewarding aspects of being in clinical psychology, but what drove you into work in emotions and suicide prevention in the first place?
Yeah, I think it was this interest in people from the very start, but I was always not just interested in people and in helping people, but also in complex stuff. And I remember reading a neuroscience study, one of the earliest neuroscience studies, probably 2005, 6 or something like that, where patients were, or subjects, it wasn't patients actually in that study, subjects were put into an fMRI scanner and they were expecting electrical shocks. And then, of course, you see activity in the amygdala and so on. And then the comparative conditions they used was that somebody held these people's hands while they were expecting the shock, or their partner held their hand. And of course, immediately you see reduced activity in the amygdala. Back then, I found this like a miracle. Wow, social stuff influences biology. By now, I'm like, yes, I mean, what else should have happened if if you feel less afraid, somewhere in your brain something's going to be less activated. But I was just really fascinated by these interactions between social interactions, social environments, and biology. And that's why I went into neuroscience and into social affective neuroscience. And then I kind of, in the replication crisis in psychology, I got fed up with neuroscience. I felt like all the problems social psychology has are even worse in social neuroscience because studies are even smaller, samples are even smaller. There's even more ways, more degrees of freedom to analyze your data. And I think that's part of why I was looking for something new and something with more societal importance. And that's how I ended up in the end doing all this social media research on mental health during the pandemic, on suicide prevention, on misinformation. And I think it probably was impactful. It's just much harder to feel. And in my current work, it's really very obvious. Patients will just tell you at the end of a talk that this was super useful, something like that.
Yeah, that's a beautiful maybe point to end on, is just the importance of societal welfare. You know, having people around you changes so much, and we kind of take that for granted. Like we said before, how emotions, comfort, validation, in the past were just taken for granted, you know, and we didn't even look at this in research. And the nice thing about this sort of affective revolution in science is we can now focus on this, how we help each other, and not sort of isolate the individual as a participant, but look at them as one aspect of a community.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Cool. Well, I guess we can wrap it up there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It was fun. Thank you.